Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike shop. Welcome to the third installment of The Bag Company. More of Pam Bogus's misadventures. I will try to pick up exactly where I left off. Dragging the oversized briefcase from the hall closet, Pam got busy calling the list of people she was going to have to notify for the cemetery outing. Angela Dingus was the first one on the list. Miss Dingus, we have a situation at the cemetery needing our attention. Great, right in the middle of my. Oh, yes, well, I'll be right there. Click. The next name was new to Pam. Somebody named Manuel Vargas. A quick check under V and then M. Pam finally found his specialty was just plain psychic stuff. That's what it said. Just plain psychic stuff. The third on the list was a Barbara, no last name given. Pam called and gave her the lowdown on the cemetery and then looked for the last name on the cemetery list. The last name was George Zimbalinski, a 60-something-year-old psychic investigator. He answered after far too many rings and then mumbled a lot about things having nothing to do with investigating anything. He agreed to show up. Just as he was about to hang up, he said, "You're bringing the inn kit, correct?" No, I didn't plan on it. Pam tried looking around for anyone that could take this part of her work assignment from her lap. Okay, I'll be there as soon as I can. She hung up, then looked at the oversized briefcase sitting by her desk. Telling Eddie she would be right back once she left the case with the investigation team, Pam drugged the inn kit out to her car. It refused her best efforts to heave the thing into the trunk. It was as if it refused to cooperate in the least. It helped not one bit. Her trunk was already full of things. Considering trying the case to the back bumper, Pam levered it into the passenger seat of the car, only getting it as far as the floor. The seat was just too high. Driving out of the parking lot, Pam headed for the cemetery. Not the new cemetery opened just this century. No, the old cemetery. The one opened just after the war between the states had been lost. The old cemetery that was said to be not just haunted, but possessed. Well, at least that's what all the kids said. Pam hoped the investigators would be there, happy to take the inn kit from her and probably help get it out of the car. She drove way across town, passing the hospital, passing the airport, almost the edge of town where she came to the old cemetery. That was its name, the old cemetery. There hadn't been an interment here in the last 60 years. It wasn't due to a lack of space, it was due to no one wanting their loved ones to be buried here. It looked like something out of a bad horror movie, a very bad horror movie, an MST3K kind of horror movie. Pam looked around, trying to figure what would be a group of psychics. What would a group of psychics look like? Probably the only four people still living standing around a bunch of parked cars. Of course, she recognized Madame Dingus. Her purple turban stood out among the gray headstones and the statue's missing appendages. The caretaker came slinking along. He looked way too much like Bruce Dern as Mr. Dudley from The Haunting. Boy, am I glad you folks showed up. It's getting way out of hand around here. He pointed around at the mess that used to be a nasty looking boneyard. All the psychics were busy looking around in all directions other than the Mr. Dudley caretaker. Pam wanted to drop the inn kit and get back to the safety of her desk. When nobody stopped to ask any questions, she found the caretaker looking at her. What exactly is going on that you need the bag company? Ghosts and spirits, howling all night long, screaming and what sounds like fighting. Flowers dying faster than the visitors can get them planted in their vases. Real crazy stuff. Some of the tombstones have been flipped over and some of the graves have been partway dug up. I see, but she didn't. Pam looked around at the mess and decided to just wing it. Right, we'll have a look-see and let you know what we find. Don't worry about a thing. You're in good hands with... Wait, that's the wrong catchphrase. We'll see what we can do. Pam looked at the four psychics, each doing their own thing. Mr. Dudley's looked alike slouched along back to the trailer parked over near the back gate. If one of y'all will help me get the inn kit out of my car, the psychics were each acting as if whatever they were doing was far more important than helping any kind of kit. Pam walked to the passenger side door. Never mind, I'll just pull it out myself. She grabbed the handle and pulled. She pulled with all of her might, what little might she had. The case came free, and Pam staggered back. The weight was too much for her, but she couldn't just drop it. She dropped the kit on the ground. Be careful with that kit, it's delicate. This from Barbara, what's her name? Pam dragged the kit across the gravel to the side where there would have been grass if not for the weeds. What's in this thing? The silence was palatable. Pam had had enough. Well, let me know what you find and how much I should charge the clients. Pam walked to the driver's side of her car. Madame Dingus said, Before you leave, would you place the inn kit over there by the statue of Odysseus? Manuel Vargas said, That's not Odysseus, that's Achilles. It's not, it's Odysseus. Look, I know my Greek mythology, that's Achilles. The two began a long and dynamic discussion on who the statue represented. Pam was about to leave when she heard, Don't go, they need you. Pam looked around, wondering where the voice was coming from. Hearing voices means you're going... Pam tried to swallow the last thought. She looked at the statue the two psychics were arguing about. That's Perseus. See, he's got a Gorgon's head in his hand. She'd seen the guy on Ancient Aliens more than once. Is that what that is? I thought it was a cabbage. Madame Dingus pulled some glasses from her purse and looked closely at the cabbage. Oh, it's a Gorgon. It doesn't matter. Put the inn kit over here by the statue. Pam thought about telling Madame Dingus where she could put the inn kit. Then her mom's face appeared in the back of her mind, telling her to listen to her elders, no matter how crazy they might be. Something to do with her aunt, who was known for her loose grasp on reality. Her mam's voice filled her head. Someday you'll be old and crazy too. Gee, thanks. Pam got busy dragging the kit across the weeds and rocks, working up a sweat as she went. Madame Dingus was busy asking questions and then listening for a response. She went as far as to hold her hand to her ear as if trying to catch a very weak voice. I know you've spoken to me before. How about now? Manuel Vargas had pulled a pendulum from his pocket and was watching it for any response. Is there anyone here that wishes to speak to me? He watched the pendulum as it hung there as if nothing were happening. The woman, Barbara, what was her last name anyway? As she was holding an electronic device in each hand, turning around in a circle looking for any activity on the dials. George Zimbalinski had put on a blindfold over his eyes and was stumbling about as if trying to find an opponent in the blind man's bluff. He tripped over a tombstone but got back up and continued his antics. Pam found the old man's actions somewhat entertaining, so she followed him along as he tripped and stumbled over half of the cemetery. Pam wanted to leave, but that voice insisted she needed to be here, for some unknown reason. She watched as George wandered between two statues and then nearly disappeared as he stepped into a partially open grave. "Watch out!" She ran to his aid. This must have been what the voice meant. George was visible from the neck up. He swung his head back and forth as if looking around, even though the blindfold was still in place. "What was that? Is somebody trying to communicate with me?" "You fell in a hole. An open grave, actually." "Who are you? Where are you buried here?" "Mr. Zimbalinski, it's me, Pam, from Bag. I called you to come investigate." George got one hand up from his abyss and lifted the edge of his cravat. Looking around, he finally focused on Pam. "Oh dear, I seem to have shrunk." "You fell in a hole." "That would explain the height difference. Then I'm not really standing in dried out sticks?" Um, Maybe you should climb out. You might be standing on someone." Pam grabbed his hand and pulled. The other psychics all did their best to not notice the effort being exhibited on the other side of the cemetery. With all the strength Pam had left, after dragging the inn kit all over town, she managed to haul Mr. Zimbalinski from the grave, along with a pair of grave's inhabitants. There was a skull attached to the foot of his attached to his foot by its teeth. Looking down, George said, "Now there's something you don't see every day." He shook his foot, trying to dislodge the toothy visage. Pam stepped back to avoid any contact with this deceased head. Her plan went awry when the skull popped loose and flew at her. With a scream, she threw her arms up, closed her eyes. The skull came to rest in her hands. "Ah!" Pam came to find George looking down at her. "Are you all right? You seem to have passed out there for a bit." Pam was on her back. The skull was sitting on her stomach, looking up at her. "Ah!" She threw herself sideways, trying to escape the deathly grimace. Pam went one way and the skull went the other. As she had put so much into her flight from the dead, she rolled over to the hole the skull had come from. With a shrill wail, Pam fell headfirst into the hole George had just been extracted from. It was dark, and it smelled like the inside of a black tank that was past its due for cleaning. Pam was laying on her back with her legs up in the air. Well, up into the shaft she had fallen down. Good thing she had her pajamas on. There was something crunchy underneath her body. It sounded like she was grinding dry leaves under her back as she tried to get up from her position. Pam tried to use her hands, but her arms had no room to maneuver. It was tight in this grave. No! It was a nightmare come true. Pam was stuck inside somebody's grave, and she hadn't even been introduced. From far, far away, she heard a voice calling from beyond the grave. Literally. "Are you all right? Can I get you anything?" The sound came to her as if from the other side of the world. "Get me out of here!" Pam yelled with all of her might. As she'd been using a lot of might here lately, it was all she could do to not freak out any more than she already was. "I'll have to get some help. Wait right there. I'll be back as soon as I can." The sound of the voice was getting harder to hear. He was walking away from her. The psychics all gathered around the hole. "She fell in there. Are you sure?" Madame Dingus wasn't thrilled by the idea she might have to reach into the hole where the dead were known to reside. George pointed down. "Look, you can see her legs." "Are you sure it's her?" Look at those shoes. They don't match. I'm sure the young lady that called me was wearing matching shoes. And how would you know that from a phone call? Well, I am psychic. Pam could just make out the sounds of the argument going on above her while she languished here in the grave. She feared her life was in the hands of those goofballs. If so, she was doomed. You're not doomed. Not yet. Gee, thanks. That makes me feel so much better. We should call somebody. Who would you suggest? Who would I suggest? It's your idea. You think of someone. Perhaps we should adjourn to a restaurant near here, discuss what our options are. No, I don't think I could eat knowing this young lady is trapped down there. It's not like we actually know her. Pam screamed with all of her might, more might than she had left. Get me out of here now! She had to stop and catch her breath. It was a bit hard to breathe in this musty tomb. Suddenly, she felt a cold, clammy hand grasp her by the ankle. Then a second hand got her by the other foot. Well, it was a start. The psychics had gathered round, and putting themselves out on someone else's behalf, they began to pull Pam from her crypt. At least 3 of them did. As her leg cleared the top of the hole, the psychics almost lost hold, letting Pam slip back down halfway. Her skirt was folded up her head, and she cleared the top of the gravesite. It hooked on something and vanished back down to the bottom of the pit. Are you all right? You gave us quite a scare. George was attempting to brush some of the dirt from her shoulders. All he managed to do was smear dirt into her formerly white blouse. Pam was so grateful to be out of the tomb she didn't notice her fashion statement until Madame Dingus said, "You wore your pajamas to work?" Pam looked down at her bright yellow pant legs with little green butterflies all over them. This, along with her black shoe and one gray shoe. What had been a white blouse was now a dark gray and green with black streaks ground into it. George helped her to her feet. If y'all don't need me any more, I think I'll be leaving now. She tried her best to walk back with dignity, feeling just a tiny bit conspicuous. As she approached her car, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. Her hair was sticking out in every direction, and she had a bone sticking across the top of her head. She swiped back her head, and with her hands sending the bone flying. Pam just wanted to get in her car and go home. To heck with this job, to heck with her uncle, to heck with all this craziness. She got in behind the wheel, got the key from the ashtray. She always left it there since the door didn't lock, and only a real desperate person would want to steal a 1980 Malibu with mismatched doors and orange shag carpet throughout. As she was about to turn the ignition, there was the voice again. If you leave, the ghosts will be unhappy. Well, they can just be unhappy without me, Pam sat there wondering what to do next. She felt like a total putz, running around in her pajamas and mismatched shoes, not to mention her hairdo. Stay. Crap, this sucks. Pam looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She used her fingers to comb out most of the bird's nest in her hair. Then she used a bit of spit and some tissue to clear up the eyeliner that had run not down, but up her forehead, since she'd been upside down. It was from sweat, not tears. Her blouse was a complete loss, and her pajamas looked like they were left over from the Dark Ages. Stepping out of her car, she wandered back over to see what was so important that required her to hang out looking like a bag lady. Or was it a BAG lady? Girl? George had his blindfold back on, but he would stop every so often and peek from one corner or the other. Ah, young lady, you decided to stay and help out with our investigation. Pam didn't want to mention the voices, even though this bunch would probably not think anything of it. Why do you have a rag tied around your eyes? Oh, It helps me with my psychic abilities. By removing one of my senses, it makes me focus on the other 9. Pam did some quick math. Yep, too many senses in his collection. Uh, so what have you found out? The spirits are not at peace. Pam considered this to be unearth shattering. Okay, I'm going to look over maybe there somewhere, somewhere over that way, as she pointed towards the area of the cemetery devoid of psychics. Walking along amongst the grave markers, she just mostly wandered, not really looking for anything. Just stay away from those clowns and get through the day. Pam stopped for a second. Was that her talking to herself or a voice in her head talking to her? She shrugged her shoulders and continued walking, away from the non action of the others. Most of the gravestones in this part of the cemetery showed dates ranging from 1861 to 1865. Wow, these are some old tombstones. Pam could barely make out most of the inscriptions. As she was coming to the farthest set of markers, she saw somebody move from one stone to the next, peeking out from the side as if looking for someone. Pam thought it was just some kid playing around until she saw the rifle. It was long, longer than any rifle Pam had ever seen. Must be a toy gun. He made it out of an old broomstick or something. She moved over to where the kid was hiding, and then said, "This is no place to play. You might fall in an open grave, or worse." What could have been worse, she wondered. The kid looked at her, then his eyes grew wide. "You can see me?" He turned his head and said, "Hey, this crazy girl can see me." As he spoke, a second, then third person popped their heads up from behind grave markers. "Holy cow, a real live person can see us!" They all stared at Pam, taking in her never-before-seen apparel. When one of them stood up from behind his cover, Pam noticed he was wearing a gray, or rather a grayish uniform of sorts. The others were wearing almost identical-looking outfits. Each had a long, thin rifle that looked very much like a real rifle, except very old. Few of them were wearing shoes. "You're not a Yankee, are you?" one said with a bit of a scowl. Soon she had nearly a dozen gray-clad characters standing around her. No, I'm from Texas, born and raised," Pam thought. Great, they're playing Civil War games." Suddenly, from behind her, Pam heard shouting, as if a large group of men were about to run her down. The gray-clad men dropped down behind their markers as Pam looked over her shoulder. Just about 50 yards away, a bunch of playmates were running at her, all waving their broomsticks and yelling as they came. This must be the Yankees the boy had been referring to. They were all dressed in blue costumes. As the blue team got close enough to act like they were winning, some aimed their not-so-toy-looking guns and pulled the triggers. Fortunately, nothing went bang. Darn it, our powder got messed up by all that rain." They began swinging the rifles like clubs, but they never seemed to make contact. Both sides were doing their best to injure each other, but none of the blows had any effect. The gray side began to push the blue side back towards some imaginary line near the center of this half of the cemetery. It took Pam a few seconds to realize these boys weren't all that young, and their weapons looked very much deadly, and they all looked like ghosts, kind of. Manuel noticed the commotion coming from the far end of the graveyard. It looked like a bunch of Civil War reenactors were using a decrepit boneyard as their playpen. Have they no respect? And that weird girl is right in the middle of the whole thing. Pam had a thought. You guys aren't playing war games, are you?" More of a statement than a question. One of the gray-clad boys said, "Nah, we're just trying to get these Yankees out of our cemetery." From the other side came, Your cemetery? Since when did it become your cemetery? As both sides began to proclaim ownership of the graveyard, they began taking aim at each other from just yards away. Pam was standing right in the middle of all of this hostility. As no bullets were flying, Pam decided to try calming things down. After all, the bag had been called to fix whatever problem was taking possession of this cemetery. Would all of y'all stop acting like you're trying to kill each other and listen? She looked at the men in gray and the men in blue. Once she had everybody's attention, which made her odd outfit feel that much odder, Pam tried her hand at making peace. You do realize you're all dead, right? Saw nods on both sides. Okay, so why continue fighting a war that ended over 150 years ago? Those Yankees don't belong in our cemetery, one of the men in gray yelled. Rifles came up on both sides. I noticed you can't seem to shoot at each other and you can't hit each other either. This brought more nods from the assembled soldiers. So why not just bring your hostilities to an end like Lee and Grant? Pam looked at the soldiers all gathered round. Some had gotten closer, looking at her as if never having seen anyone in pajamas and high heels before. One of the soldiers, dressed a bit better than most, said, "You know, we lost the war. It's just that, well, a wagon train full of dead Yankees accidentally got delivered here. The gravediggers didn't much care for the horrendous smell coming from the bodies, so they buried 'em here next to us." He pointed to some graves. "We got along okay until one night we discovered the grave markers were so beat up we couldn't figure out which grave belonged to which of us." Pam began to understand. You can't find your tombstones because the lettering is in such rough condition? Yeah, I came out to have a look-see, but when I tried to get back into my coffin, there was some guy in there already, one of the Union soldiers put in. A 100-watt light bulb appeared over Pam's head. "If you can get your grave markers straightened out, will y'all stop digging up grave site and stop destroying the place?" The assembled soldiers nodded. Some still gave their counterparts evil looks. "Wait right here, I'll be right back." Pam took off running, only a few steps. Running through the dirt in high heels was just not going to work. Walking as quick as she could, Pam went to her car to get some supplies. The psychics were all still doing their best, but not finding the problem. Madame Dingus was looking at her cards, which she had laid out on top of a granite vault. "Is there anyone here wishing to speak to me?" George was sitting next to a statue, very much asleep. Manuel Vargas was in an animated conversation with somebody only he could see. "So you're telling me all this damage was caused by Civil War soldiers fighting each other?" He listened for a minute. "But this is the South. Where would a bunch of Union soldiers come from?" Barbara, whatever her last name was, had a new electronic device out, waving it in the air and looking at the gauges. Pam grabbed her purse and walked quickly back to the soldiers, hoping to get back before the hostilities cranked up again. Pulling a notebook and a pen from her purse, she got busy. "Okay, what's your name and who was buried beside you?" She started with the well-dressed soldier, figuring he must be an officer. As she took names and who was buried next to who, Pam had to cross out a name or two and rewrite them as the gathered men tried to remember who was next to who. Soon, well, not all that soon, Pam had the layout that all the soldiers agreed looked right. "I'll get your names put on some markers if you'll stop destroying things and making so much noise." She looked around at the men, nodding their assent. "And how about fixing up some of the damage you've done over the years?" More nods. Pam walked back to her car, wondering how she'd fulfill her promise to the dead. George opened one eye, and then the other. "Ah, young lady, have you found an answer to the rest of us have been missing?" He pulled himself up to his feet and tried to stand. He found one leg was still asleep. Pam figured she'd had nothing to lose. There's a bunch of pissed off ghosts because their tombstones are messed up. They promised to stop trashing the place as long as we get their grave markers fixed. She looked at George, hoping he believed her. Well, we could get grave markers online for about $250 each. How many do you need? Pam looked at her list. 26. Oof. $6,500 plus shipping. Maybe they'll give us a discount for quantity. George scratched his head. Which war did they serve in? The war between the states. Well, so much for getting the military to pay for them. Pam felt lost some more. What can I do? I promised I'd get them new grave markers. How about plastic? I know a guy who knows a guy who makes Halloween props. He could knock them out for about $25 each. 650 is a lot easier to take than 6,500. Let me talk to Bruce or Mr. Dudley. What was the caretaker's name? Pam went to speak to whoever he was about maybe purchasing some new headstones. Pam arrived back at the bag headquarters at 3:30. She didn't feel like going inside, but she was beginning to feel like it was her job. Well, it was her job, but she now felt like it was more hers. The N kit was once more in the front seat, placed there by Mr. Dudley impersonator, just after he agreed to purchase 26 fox headstones. He also took the bill for the bag investigation. He'd forwarded it to the owners of the cemetery. Pam figured the chances of getting paid was slim to none. Back at her desk, there were 3 people waiting to see various staff members. They each took turns trying to not stare at Pam's outfit. There was also a pile of phone messages. Pulling out some paper, Pam looked at the bizarre-looking typing machine. It looked as if it was left over from the Revolutionary War. Must be hundreds of years old. She was going to lift it from the shelf over to her desk, but found it weighed way too much. Looking over her shoulder, Pam saw the waiting folks were each enraptured by whichever magazine they had found to keep them occupied while waiting. They took turns stealing glances in her direction. Standing up near the shelf, Pam lined up a paper with the round tube and used the knob to roll the paper into place. She'd seen this done in an old movie one time. It looked about right to her, so she hit one of the keys. Oops, wrong one. She looked for the delete button. She looked at every button. Not a one said delete. Pam ripped the paper from the carriage and tossed it in the trash can. Inserting a new piece of paper, she began again. Hammering out her field report, she wanted it to look good so her uncle could maybe get some money from the owners of the old cemetery. The trash can was full. It could hold no more. The floor around it was scattered with crumpled up paper. Pam got a pencil and wrote out a short, brief, not too redundant report. The eraser was her delete button. The report looked more like a first-grade essay than a report for a business. Sticking it on top of the outbasket, Pam looked at the phone messages. Please call Stanley about a shipment of Filboid studge. It was signed by Mikey Baba Ganoush. Wait, isn't Stanley the werewolf? The next phone message was from Ray. Won't be in tomorrow, just keep doing as you're doing. Yes, as you're doing. It had been written out by Eddie. Figured he'd write exactly how my uncle talked. Thumbing through the stack, Pam saw one from a Mr. Armstrong. Found your boyfriend, got him on ice in the basement. Pam was shocked. Bob was the farthest thing from a boyfriend, was being held downstairs, probably against his will. She got up and ran to the basement stairs. At the door, she paused. There had to be some reason the door was barred so well. It looked as if somebody was trying to keep something from coming up. Lifting the wood beam from its brackets, Pam thought this was a bad idea. She carefully opened the door and looked through the crack. Nothing was lurking at the top of the stairs. She slipped a hand through the crack and fumbled for the light switch. There was a single bulb halfway down the stairs. Stairs that went on way too long. The basement must be 2 stories underground. Careful so as to not alert any monsters hiding in the area of the stairs, Pam slipped through the door and took a step down into the dimly illuminated stairway. The tread creaked under her slight weight. She looked down at the dark cellar at the very bottom of this long flight. The stairs had been built leaving space where the risers should have been. Taking the next step, she felt somewhat vulnerable. She could just imagine something scuttling about down below. The next step didn't lead to Pam's demise, so she tried another one. Her high-heeled shoe-clad foot felt as if it was about to be grabbed by a thing hiding under the stairs. She turned sideways so she could see any beast as they slipped their claw-covered appendage through the riser space. Now she could only step down 1 step at a time, but she felt a bit safer. Safe like a rabbit standing in a pit full of rattlesnakes and scorpions. Safe, right? Clunk, click, clunk, click. Her mismatched shoes were making mismatched sounds. Stepping down a few more steps, Pam stopped to listen. Was that breathing she heard? Listening hard, she could hear something thumping like a small drum being pounded on very fast. She took a while to realize it was her heart pounding in her ears. Pam closed her eyes and tried to calm down. Take it easy, just get down there, get Bob. Don't need to get arrested for false imprisonment. Pam took a few more steps. Her high heels made way too much noise as she went. Clunk, click, clunk, click, clunk. That was the tread, not her shoe. As Pam passed under the single bulb hanging from the cord from way up there by the ceiling, she stopped to catch her breath. Her hand was shaking as she grasped the handrail. Sweat was trickling down her spine, cold against her hot skin. Her legs felt weak from having descended just 10 feet. 10 feet of fear-laced agony. This must be how it feels to run a marathon. She saw people running one on TV. They looked like she felt right now. Maybe she should call out to Bob, see if he's still alive. If the monsters have already ate him, there was little sense in her continuing. Pam tried to lick her lips. Her tongue was as dry as her palms were not. She was leaving sweat stains on the handrail. Better stay quiet. The thing in the dark might not know I'm here yet, Pam reasoned. The next several steps took all of her strength. Clunk, click, crunch. The crunch was something laying on the tread under her foot. Looking down, she could see something was there, sticking out from under her shoe. Looking close, Pam saw it was a dead rat. A long dead rat. Not that it was long in length, but long in time. More like a skeleton rat than a fur-covered rat. A cold shudder ran through Pam's body. She closed her eyes so she wouldn't stare at the dead thing, but then quickly opened them. Something made a sound. A sound like a large girl-eating creature slithering about. A giant snake with a human body, or a multi-armed octopus with 6 legs and claws everywhere. Pam tried to get her imagination to quit coming up with new and horrendous things she didn't want to see. But you know how the human mind works. The more you try not to think of something, the more your evil mind will focus on said subject. Pam felt her knees knocking together. The soft, cottony legs of her pajamas smacked together with an audible thud. Pam was so glad she'd missed breakfast and lunch. Otherwise, both meals would have found their way back up and out and then down the front of her already smeared blouse. Her stomach was in knots. The bottom of the stair came under her foot at last. The floor of the basement was dirt. No one had bothered to put in a floor when the place was built, and no one had bothered since. To make matters worse, the room was divided up into dozens of small rooms, each with its own nefarious purpose. Which one are the bodies buried in? Pam almost slapped herself for coming up with that one. There was a loud gurgling sound over her head. Clamping both hands over her mouth, Pam looked up to see what was about to drop down on her and suck her brains out through her ears. There in the darkness above, she spotted a sewer pipe. Someone had just flushed the throne upstairs. With a bit of a giggle, Pam began the arduous task of looking for Bob. Is there a bunch of old cells down here used to detain prisoners that would later be used for scientific experiments? That took the giggle right out of her. It was dark, not dark like the inside of a cave, but dark like the scene in a horror movie where the girl in the basement gets dismembered by the killer. Pam felt as if she were the girl in the basement, which she was. Bob, she said, just loud enough to be heard in her own mind. Bob, are you there? A bit louder. Now she could hear her own voice. Bob, are you down here? She used her inside voice this time. Pam listened for an answer, or a monster, slithering to see who was talking. Once more, the sound of her heartbeat drowned out any other sounds. The darkness seemed to swirl around her. The shadows took turns, moving only when she was looking somewhere else. The light only reached the area right around the last step. Bob, if you're down here, say something. Otherwise, I'm out of here. Pam slowly backed to the stairs. Slowly became quickly. Her foot found the first step leading up. She started up as fast as her legs could move. The growl came to her from downstairs. By midway, she was taking 3 steps at a time. Her heels made a racket like someone trying to knock down a lumber yard with a sledgehammer. Making the top step, Pam grabbed the doorknob and turned it. The door flew open. She scrambled through, slamming the door behind her. She lifted the beam up from where she'd dropped it and slammed it into the brackets. Turning her back to the door, she came face to face with Eddie and the narcissistic woman. The mirror was down by the woman's side as she looked at Pam's fashion faux pas. Eddie said, "Were you in the basement?" Pam nodded her head. "Yes, I went to check on Bob." "Oh, well, Mr. Armstrong has him locked in his basement at his house." "Mr. Armstrong's?" "No, Bob's. His mom agreed to not let him out till all this mess blows over." "Oh, well, I went down there and something growled at me." Eddie looked at the door, now secured with a locking bar. Then he looked at Pam's outfit. "Rough day, huh?" How cute, the woman with the mirror fixation turned and went out the front door. The mirror was once more up in her view. Pam straightened her pajamas out and then ran a hand through her hair. "Who's the I'm the most beautiful person on earth woman?" "Oh, her? That's Dolores de la Noche. She's not looking at herself, she's scrying." The look of understanding was missing from Pam's face. "She's looking into a mirror at an angle to see anything that might be lurking behind her." Pam thought it over and then said, "You mean like looking over your shoulder?" "Yes, but to an extreme. Dolores was nearly devoured by a gremlin, so now she goes around scrying all the time." "Oh my God, devoured by a gremlin? What happened? Did she get seriously hurt?" "No, but her shoe was a total loss." "Her shoe?" Pam looked down at her mismatched footwear. "She had to bury it in the yard." "Well, this day is over now. Tomorrow will be much better, I hope." Pam grabbed her cell phone from the shelf by the door and headed out to the parking lot. When Pam got home, her mom was in the kitchen. Pam slipped in and ran up to her room. Get cleaned up and changed before her folks saw her. "So how was your day at work?" "You know, the usual. Paperwork, phone calls." Pam wondered if she'd ever get courage to tell them what was going on during her time at work. A demon Pedro was skulking about looking for something to destroy. He thought about maybe just setting fire to someone's house, but that wasn't nearly big enough. No, he wanted to destroy the whole town. He wanted a bomb, a big bomb. But where do you buy a big bomb? And Pedro wished he could go home and hide under his bed, but a demon Pedro had other plans. Pulling his wallet out, he looked to see how much cash he had on hand. $15. Not much. He wondered how much a big bomb he could get for $15. The demon was growing angrier by the bunch of goofs that had summoned him. Why, oh why, couldn't he be summoned by some high-class evildoer instead of a bunch of dweebs? He skulked away in search of havoc to do. Chapter 5, The Midnight Rendezvous. Pam got up early. She took a shower and did her hair. As she picked out a nice-looking outfit for the day, she went the extra step of ironing the dress and the blouse so she would look sharp. Then she went downstairs in plenty of time to have breakfast with her folks and take a leisurely drive to the office. As she was walking into the kitchen, her cell phone rang. It rang and it rang. Pam reached out from under the blanket to try to find her phone. Looking at the screen, she saw it was 7:45. Her alarm was going off. She'd overslept again. Jumping out of bed, she scrambled to get dressed. Pulling on clothes, she grabbed some shoes and then checked to be sure they matched. Running down the stairs, she told her mom she was on her way. Paula just shook her head. How was Pam ever going to survive without somebody to keep her alive? Pam got to the mansion at 8:15, not too late considering she had yet to leave the office before way late at night. Running inside, she plopped down behind her desk, then pulled her shoes on, making sure they were on the right foot. No one was waiting to see any of the staff, so Pam took a minute to do her makeup before going for coffee. Eddie had the book Bob had brought in, sitting on the bar. He was flipping through the pages looking for answers. More like words. The book was completely blank now. Find what you're looking for? Pam mixed her usual additives. Then she grabbed a few old triangular sandwiches to stave off her hunger. No, I was hoping to find some reference to the name of the demon these kids summoned, but all the pages are blank. Eddie showed Pam several blank pages. If you can find his name, we have a handle to work with. Can't you just try several names and see which one works? There are thousands. It would take years to go through them all. Eddie flipped a few more pages and then gave up and went back to cleaning coffee cups. That's weird-looking paper. What is it? It's not paper, it's vellum, goat skin, I think. That's why old books last so long. Wanda Burkowski looked as if she'd been dusted. The spider webs were gone, and there was a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. It was cold, so it had been a while since her last fix-up. Pam looked at her very close. Yes, she was breathing. Now, that's what I'd call focused. Pam headed out to her desk. A few people came in to see either Madame Dingus or Cassandra Blavatsky. Mrs. Clark brought Garrett in. It was time for another one of his card experiments. The science guys were already on the second floor, ready to run him through their paces. Pam was looking forward to a quiet day. The phone rang. The bag company, how may I help you? Her best perky voice ever. Hello? I'm wondering, that is, we were wondering, just how discreet are you folks? Discreet is our middle name, right next to reliable and considerate. So if we ask you to look into something, you won't tell anyone? As long as you pay us. Pam thought that one sounded bad. Just kidding. Yes, we can be relied on to keep our mouths shut at no extra charge. That still sounded bad. Pam could hear a mumbled conversation in the background. The caller was trying to come to a decision. Pam could have sworn she'd heard a grandfather clock tick, tick, ticking in the background. Then the caller was back. Okay, here's the problem. We have a building that, well, people hear strange noises coming from it late at night. Pam wrote down the information. Strange noises. How old is this structure? Oh, wow, it's like super old. It was moved from the old part of the park last year. Come to think of it, that's when the noises started. Pam asked, The park? Are you guys at the city park? No, we're at the state park. That's why we need total discretion. And when is the best time to do an investigation? How about late, like around midnight? I'll put you down for one of our graveyard shift investigations. Pam looked down at the pertinent information and then placed the request in the outbox. There was a sound of yelling coming from the second floor. Then a door slammed. Soon, one of the science guys, Dr. Minskakabaski, or was it Dr. Rendon? Pam forgot who was who. Anyway, a guy in a white lab coat came storming down the stairs, went out the door, and slammed it. Well, slammed it as far as it would go. From upstairs, Pam heard a good riddance. Pam thought about this and just ignoring the outburst. The science guys were always yelling and storming about, but her overdeveloped sense of duty began to eat at her. This sense of duty was new to her, only developed in the last few days, like yesterday, right around the time she found she could verse with the dead. Pam shoved her chair back and took a quick stroll to just check on the situation. She wasn't the least concerned about the three new scientists. She just wanted to be sure Garrett and his mother weren't in any kind of strife. That sounded like a good word. Maybe not the right word, but it sounded cool. Hoofing it up the stairs, Pam found the task was just the slightest bit less trying. Sure, her legs hurt, and so did other muscles involved in climbing. It helped not at all doing so in heels, but it felt as if she were working out, just enough to ignore any subconscious desires to join a gym. At the top of the stairs, Pam hardly had to catch her breath before making her way to the room occupied by the Zener card wizard. Speaking of wizard, Pam looked around herself, wondering whatever became of the great Manfred. Knocking at the door to room 2A, Pam waited just a second before opening and stepping through. Is everything all right? I just saw Dr. She looked around at the two lab-coated men and tried to remember who was who. Dr. Minsk's baby heading out the door. Dr. Mansfield answered in his best haughty voice. He had to leave, a prior engagement at the amusement park. Perhaps if you didn't call him a giant diaper head, he'd not storm out so often. This was from Dr. Rendon. Pam looked at Mrs. Clark. Can I get you anything? Coffee, water? Garrett's voice came. I'd like a Coke. Pam was hoping to just see to it that all was right here and not have to make several trips up and down. And you, ma'am? Oh, a cup of coffee would be nice. Pam turned and headed back down before the doctors could come up with requests. She only had 2 hands and sure wasn't going to heft a tray up the stairs. Once in the coffee shop, Pam placed her order and then took a minute to relax and prepare for her next attempt at summiting the stairs. Any luck on the demon book? She asked, more as a delaying tactic than a real question. Nope, I tried using infrared ultraviolet light. Eddie had added all the right ingredients to Mrs. Clark. He knew how everybody took their coffee. Putting a lid on the cup, he said, I wish one of the staff could just look at it and tell us what we need to know. Pam headed back up to the next floor. What did I say about not hating these stairs? This time she paused to catch her breath. Here's your coffee, and here, young man, is your soda. Pam looked at Garrett. How's it going? Great, even after he'd called the Indian guy a giant diaper head. This caused Garrett to start laughing. Once Pam was convinced the scientists weren't causing any undue constraint to her guests, Pam took off for her desk and some much needed rest. Demon Pedro wanted desperately to destroy something. So far, he'd managed to set fire to a few dumpsters and tip over a few trash cans. His entertainment level was not anywhere near being sustained. Walking along a street, he spotted an army surplus store. The army had bombs. The army had way too many bombs. Maybe they would sell him one or two or 20. He headed across the street to inquire into purchasing a few explosive devices. Pam was about to go looking for the great Manford, wizard extraordinaire, when she saw the investigation request for tonight had been picked up, added to, and returned to the inbox. Picking it out of the inbox, she read the addendum. Everyone is busy. Get with George and handle this. It was signed by some unknown hand that Pam couldn't decipher. Great. What am I supposed to do? Come in at midnight? She grabbed the Rolodex and looked up George Zimbalowski. She looked under G and then Z. Nothing. Think, how could somebody screw up George's name? Looking under S, she saw Psychic, Syck, George. Oh, that's just stupid. Dialing the number, she listened to the phone ringing, and then she heard George's voice. Yes, how can I help you? Mr. Zimbalinski, this is Pam from the Bag Company. She listened to George. Yes, that was me. Yes, I fell in an open grave. Yes, I'm fine now. She listened some more. There's a request for an investigation for midnight tonight. Are you up for it? Yes, sure. Can you pick me up at 11:30? Oh, no, I'm not going to be there. I'm just checking to see if you could do it. Well, yes, but not on my own. Are you sure you can't come along? You are a very gifted psychic. You could probably handle this one on your own. Me? I'm not a psychic. I just answer the phone, take messages. And you speak to the ghosts from the Civil War. That was just. Pam wondered what had gone on. She saw a bunch of ghosts. She spoke to them. They spoke to her, but she wasn't psychic. That was something someone else did. She had just the tiniest worry that just maybe she was hearing things. Pam had a thought. What would her mom say about her being psychic and her needing to be at work at midnight? Let me get back with you. I need to call someone first. She hung up, then stared at the phone, wondering if she was wasting her time calling to ask to be allowed to go to a park late at night with a strange old man. She dialed her home phone number. Howdy, Mom. I have a weird request. There's this old man that works for Uncle Ray, and he needs a ride to work tonight, and I was asked to take him. It's at midnight, and I don't think it's such a good idea, but I thought I'd ask you first, before I said I couldn't make it. Oh, that's nice, dear. Be sure to dress warm. It's supposed to be cold tonight. Pam was shocked. Her mom was okay with her driving around town late at night with George. She didn't even know who he was. Or did she? Pam began to wonder if just maybe her folks and her uncle were making things happen to point Pam in some direction of their choosing. Were things going on behind the scenes Pam was not aware of? Well, yeah, there was a lot going on. Pam had no idea of what and where, and when, or for that matter. She called George back. My mom's, I'll pick you up at 11:30 tonight. Sounds like a date. He hung up before Pam could say anything to the contrary. Great. Now I have a late night date with a man 3 times my age. Pam looked around for someone to blame. I need some coffee. She headed to the shop. What can I get you? Eddie had his usual smile. A large Americano with a shot. Eddie made the preferred drink, adding more espresso to give it real zip. Pam looked down the bar at Wanda Murkowski. Mr. Techno, what's the deal with Miss Murkowski? You know, how did she wind up like that? Pam pointed to the still woman. Well, let's see. Somebody asked her a question about something. I'm not sure what the question was. He took a long look at the thinking woman. It must have been important. She's been working on it for a long time. Eddie scratched his head. I think there's a copy of the question written down somewhere. Pam figured the way things were filed around here, it could be anywhere. The phone began to ring. A bag company, may we help you? It's me, Mr. Armstrong. No one else had that voice. Do you know a guy named Gonzalez, Pedro? I know a Pedro Gonzalez. He was in my class till he dropped out. He was one of Bob's friends. You date him? No, and I never dated Bob. Mr. Armstrong cut her off. He was picked up by PD. He was trying to buy some explosives from an army surplus store. The sound of pages being flipped. It says here he looked green when the cops got there. He tried to fight, never a good idea. The taser was hardly out of the holster before he ran out of steam real quick. Pedro was one of the boys in the junkyard. He helped out in the demon ceremony. You date some really weird kids. I never dated any of them. Pam was getting pissed. Listen up, sister. Any more of your boyfriends I need to watch for? She nearly slammed the phone down. Yes, there were 6 of them. So far, we've seen 4. Pam thought hard about who all ran around with Bob. Are you sure it was 6, not 12? A coven is made up of 12. Bob only had so many friends, and one of them wasn't really his friend, just some guy nobody else would hang out with. So you dated him too? Pam felt not just the least bit better after she slammed the phone into the cradle. How have I gotten on for so long without being able to do that? She wondered. The front door opened. Pam looked up from her work, which was actually a crossword puzzle. There was nobody standing there. This sort of thing was becoming commonplace, so Pam considered getting up and closing the entrance, as closed as it would get. A head appeared at the edge of the doorframe. Just the top half, the half with the hair and 2 eyes on it. Slowly, the rest of the noggin came into view. Soon, there was an entire head, along with shoulders and part of the body. Pam asked, Can I help you? Are you guys the Paranormal Busters? We're the anomalous group. We look into just about anything odd. Pam found it hard to explain just exactly what it was they did. A quick look back over her shoulder to be sure no one was watching, the young girl slipped through the door and pushed it as closed as it would get. I need your help. There's something weird going on at my house. The girl looked to be about 12, if that old. Can you come by and fix it? Pam offered the visitor a chair and then said, That will depend on what it is and if it's weird and what's going on. Pam figured this young kid had heard something late one night and now thought her home was haunted. It's my mother. She's been taken over by something and I want it gone. Pam thought about a movie she had seen a long time ago, something to do with pod people. Something is odd about your mother. Pam thought about how her mom had changed since going to the Dave clinic. She's sucking the life out of me, the young girl said. Aha. Pam had heard this before from all of her girlfriends. It was just ordinary teenage angst. It's called puberty. As you develop, you start to think things like no one understands me and all the problems in the world are mine. Pam had heard this on a TV show one day while trying to study for a test. She remembered the TV show, but not what the test was on or whether she'd passed it or not. Pam found she had an overpowering urge to help this young girl, as if she were being manipulated from afar. Maybe she should start by getting a name so she wouldn't have to keep calling her young girl in her head. Let's start by getting your name and address. Pam grabbed a pencil and a notepad. My name is Sarah Bellum. I live just up the street from you. Pam thought about this decrepit, run-down, nasty neighborhood. You live around here? Maybe that's the problem. No, not here, over by where you live. I recognized you once I came in. Your family seems so nice and normal. If she only knew. So your mother doesn't understand you. No, not that. She's draining me any time I'm near her. I feel as if I'm dying and if I stay close to her for too long. Oh, that must be fun on a long trip. Pam thought maybe this was more than just angst. It's far worse than that. Pam didn't even flinch now. What what with you being a neighbor and all, she needs your help more than most. Being so young, Sarah couldn't possibly have any money. Since we're practically neighbors, I will give you the family discount. Pam wished the voices in her head would bother someone else. Tell me about your mother. Well, she's really old, like 35 or 36. She stayed at home until I was in seventh grade, and then she went to work, some place called Forever Youth, a kind of a fashion store, but for the in crowd. Sarah rolled her eyes up, trying to think. She's kind of obsessed with getting old, like Elizabeth Bathory, but without the bloodletting. Pam tried to rack her brain. Who was Elizabeth Bathory? I'll have to consult with one of our resident experts on how to get the bottom of your problem and your mother's problem as well. Pam was taking a few notes. I'll be right back. Can I get you anything? Stepping into the library coffee shop, she asked Eddie, Who's Elizabeth Bathory? Ah, Bathory Elizabeth. She was a weird princess back in the late 1500s. She was obsessed with growing old. She discovered the blood of young girls would keep her young. It worked in a kind of a bizarre way. She died at 54. Pam said, I need a triple shot of espresso with 4 scoops of sugar and my usual. And what do you know about someone that is sucking the life out of their kid? Teenage angst? No, like in real life sucking it out. Maybe it's a psychic vampire. Eddie grabbed a book from the shelf behind him and slid it across to her. Pages 140 to 165. Pam tucked the book under her arm, grabbed one coffee in each hand. Using one foot, she managed to get the library door open and returned to her customer. Setting one cup in front of Sarah, You like espresso? Ever since my mom started sucking the energy out of me, it's the only thing that keeps me going. Okay, according to our resident expert, you just might be dealing with a psychic vampire. Pam got the book open to the recommended pages. It says here you should try wearing purple as a means of protection. Great, I have absolutely nothing in purple. Sarah looked pensive. You could try building a protective wall of light around yourself to ward off your mother's advances. Now Sarah looked downright lost. We could do a healing on your mother. Sarah perked up at the last one. How does that work? Can you do it from here? Pam stammered. Well, I think she'd have to come in and undergo a healing with Cassandra Blavatsky. Sarah sank. My mother would never come here, let alone allow anything out of the ordinary to be done to her. Pam was getting desperate. Let me check with Miss Blavatsky. She jumped up and ran down the hall. With a quick knock, she swung the door open. Cassandra Blavatsky was right in the middle of one of her regulars. Never in an annoyed state, Cassandra asked, How can I help you, dear? Can you do your thing without the patient being present? Yes, I can. I can do a remote healing. It's not as effective sometimes, but still it can be beneficial. Thanks. Pam went back to her client. Can we do a remote healing without your mother knowing anything about it? It should help. Not. I hope Pam really wished the voices would help out more and interfere less. Sarah stood up, ready to go on with her day. Should I leave a deposit or something? She reached into a plastic purse hung from one shoulder. Pam thought hard about it. No, let's just get your mom fixed. Sarah was holding a handful of cash. Are those ones? Nah, I have about $850 here. Sarah held up a wad of bills. Oh, why do you always run around with so much greenbacks on you? Only if I think I might need something. Usually I just use my plastic. Sarah held up an American Excess card. Uranium. Pam was dumbfounded. This kid had better credit than she ever be able to achieve. Well, anyway, we'll see what we can do about fixing your mom, and then maybe you won't feel so run down. Pam watched Sarah to the door. How are you getting home? My sister's waiting for me just outside in the parking lot. Pam saw a brand new Jaguar. The girl behind the wheel looked like a bigger version of Sarah. Pam had seen that car cruising around her neighborhood and wondered who could afford such a thing. Now she knew. Well, that's been an hour and 10 minutes. I'm going to take it off here, and I will hopefully be back in a little while with number 3 in this earth shattering version of the Bag Company. Hope you're enjoying the story so far.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.